Howdy, and welcome back to my channel. There's significantly more of you than there was the last time I released a video. Welcome, welcome. You might have noticed in my last video that I was wearing a camisole underneath my corset. You should never wear a corset on bare skin. Yes, I made a corset before I made a chemise. I'd avoided making a chemise because it's, let's be honest, not necessarily a terribly exciting project, but I needed something to go under my corset, and specifically it needed to have shoulders wide set enough for my planned Halloween project for this year, which is gonna be a big old ball gown. I also just kinda wanted to do something with insertion lace because it's pretty. The idea of black undergarments from the Victorian era isn't unheard of. Once combination suits were invented, there are some records of black ones, so it wasn't like this was completely unfounded. However, mostly I just wanted to be goth and extra and have no patience when it comes to things made out of white fabric. I also wanted to make use of some cotton lawn that I had purchased and started using for a dress based off Daenerys' Carthene gown, but that project wasn't going well, and I could tell that I was simply going to abandon it or have to completely restart. So I salvaged that fabric to use on this project. I also used a little bit of black lace from my stash in addition to the super lightweight cotton lawn. Pro tip if you are buying lace, sort out your lace when you first get it into bits that look like they belong together, because that would have definitely saved me a lot of time as I went through my black lace stash trying to pair up lace for this. After I'd liberated my lawn from the bits that I was not going to bother unpicking, not that much fabric really, I chopped off the rolled hem that I had done on either side because it was going to make my seams too bulky, and also because it was going to end up way too wide. And I did this with pinking shears, even though I cut it down further a little bit later, because I was just cutting everything pretty much with this project with pinking shears because I wasn't sure how I wanted to finish all the seams. And for this design I decided to go with a yoked chemise where all the fabric on the main body gets gathered into a yoke that extends around the neck and the shoulders. I actually used the facing pattern from my favorite sleeveless dress pattern in order to start drafting the yoke, but I did edit the pattern a little bit in order to make the shoulders more wide set. Victorian evening wear tended to be very wide set at the neckline, almost off the shoulder, but not quite. So I needed something that would allow for that, so I just kind of eyeballed it when I was doing my pattern. I didn't do this in any specific way, I just kind of moved the strap over and also added about 1/4 of an inch onto each so that I would have plenty of room in case I ended up being something weird with the pattern. For the yoke, I did utilize the original rolled hem just at the center front because there were going to be buttons there. But I wasn't particularly careful about this because I knew I had enough fabric to recut if it really ended up being janky. And once again, I wasn't totally sure how I was gonna put this all together, so I used pinking shears when I cut it out. I did up the shoulder seams and what would be the side seams if this was longer, and just ran them through my machine real quick to make sure it would fit before I tried doing any insertion lace or anything, because I had not tested this pattern. Chemises tend to be pretty loose garments. They're not very fitted, and they're not particularly meant to be. This meant this was way scarier for me than when I was drafting the corset, because at least the corset had a specific way that it was supposed to fit. That's also part of the reason that this chemise is kind of very roughly finished, and I wasn't sure I was gonna like it. Like, I needed it, but I wasn't sure that I was going to like wearing it, so I wasn't willing to put a ton of time into hand felling all the seams or French seaming everything when I might just hate it. Once my side seams and my shoulder seams were done up, I very briefly tried it on my dress form just to make sure nothing looked wonky, and trimmed off the part of the yoke that just made it look a little bit like it was drooping down at the center back, which I didn't like the look of. I wanted it to be more or less straight across. I didn't have any particular plan for where I was gonna put this lace before I started doing this, so I just kind of went with what seemed like it would be a good idea and just kind of put it on there, and it ended up being 4 strips of lace per side. And I just kind of pinned it down and then ran top stitching as close as possible to the edge without being off the edge on either side of the strip of lace. This isn't inaccurate, but definitely would have been a cheaper feature seen on cheaper garments that would have been mass manufactured during the Victorian era, rather than something that was well made at home, which probably would have been hand felled around the pieces of lace. But I knew that if I did that, I was simply never going to finish it, so I just cut open behind it after I top stitched it down and ironed it and moved on to the next one. I was never going to finish it if I didn't do it that way. Once my lace was inserted, I also put some along the edge of the neckline and the armholes of the chemise because I thought it made a neat detail there, and I had lace, so might as well use it. And like before, I didn't do anything complicated in applying this lace. I just sort of pinned it to the wrong side of the fabric and flipped it outward so that it would behave and be an edging on the neck and the arms of the chemise. And then fixing one that I had applied incorrectly later, I had a yoke gently flapping in the breeze because it was still hot when I was working on this. I will admit I did not film my cutting out of the body pieces, the general shape of them at least, because it was boring. It was just a 57 by 24 square and a 57 by 10 square. But then, the significantly less boring part was putting the lace on. And I used a slightly different method because I wanted to have a bigger hem at these, because I do intend to eventually fell them one day, but for now the hem is just top stitched into its place. Like I said, this isn't inaccurate. I do have a mass-produced petticoat in my personal, very small collection that is finished very similar to this, with the bits around the insertion lace just kind of left raw. So I think it would have been very period appropriate in mass manufactured garments for a chemise to be finished at home and just be sent out without any hand felling or just with what top stitching they could do by machine. At this point I had a box with lace, so I pinned my box with lace to my dress form and generally pinned it so that I had all of the fabric spread out evenly and messily pleated it down so that I could pin the yoke itself on top of the dress form, and it worked pretty good. This isn't a very technical draping method. I have no formal draping experience, but it worked well enough for me to get a garment that functioned. I just started off trying to have it pinned fairly evenly all the way around because it was a straight piece of fabric, and then pinned the yoke on as best I can, and then marked where the edges around that were over the pleats so that I would have a rough idea of where to cut so that I could do the actual gathering for the actual final version. And I only did one side with that and copied over by folding the fabric to make sure that they ended up symmetrical, since I've had bad experiences with that in the past, no matter how many times I try and get it done correctly. I ran a very long stitch length along the top where I knew the gathers were going to need to be on the chemise in order to give myself spaces to actually gather that fabric down. Then I pinned it onto the yoke and just kind of gathered it and arranged it until I thought it looked pretty, using a general sense of where, like the very bottom of the curve where the armhole was, in order to determine how everything should match up. Like I said, it's not a very technical method, but I ended up with a wearable garment, so it's not that bad. Then I sewed my rectangle with a yoke into a tube with a yoke, leaving an 8-inch gap at the very top to make space for my buttons so that it could actually be taken on and off. Eventually I intend to hand fell these edges down, but today is not that day. Like I said, originally I wasn't sure about how I was going to finish a lot of these seams. These ones have enough seam allowance that I'm not too concerned, but with the bit around the yoke, top stitching it downward wasn't going to be an option, and top stitching it upward would send it directly into being seen through the bobbin lace. So I ended up hand felling where the yoke and the body of the chemise meet, and it took a long time. That's about my extent of my hand sewing patience. After that, I start either putting the project down and never picking it back up, or doing dumb things so that I don't have to do any more hand sewing. What I did do by machine, though, was top stitch to secure all of the seam allowances down on my lace inserts and my little lace border so that I didn't have to fill them by hand. And also to keep those secure so that they didn't keep falling into where the actual lacework is and ruin the illusion of that just being open. I also turned over twice and sewed down either side of the future button placket where the opening to the chemise is so that you can get it on and off. I sewed the buttons on at this point, but both the footage and the lighting is very poor quality because at the time I was on Discord streaming Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island to my Discord board because I figured that I would while I was doing that. And I considered doing tiny loops for these buttons, but I got started and decided that that was gonna take too long, so instead I decided to do some pretty lilac ribbon because it was what I had to tie knots in it and use that as little button loops secured to the very edge of my loop side of my button placket. And these are pretty easy and simple to do. You just tie one singular knot in your ribbon pretty firmly, about as wide as your button is so that the button will be able to get in and out of it, and cut them apart, and then you can seal the ends with fire if you're using a polyester ribbon, which I am because that is what is available to me. Then you secure each loop down on the inside, like where the button would go, of those loops instead of the outside to make sure that the knot will be caught by your stitching and it won't be able to pull out. You can also go through the actual ribbon if you feel so inclined to make it a little bit more secure. And with that, I had a chemise finished. I'm still not making a pair of drawers because I don't like wearing drawers. But I had a chemise with less difficulty than there could have been, and without, unlike several pairs of combinations, them turning out to just be on my UFO shelf eternally. And I finished it just in time for it to become wildly seasonally inappropriate as the weather cools off. It is now officially cold at night here. the lightweightness of this lawn is also why I'm not gonna wear this for the internet, because it's a little bit too transparent for comfort for me to wear in front of a camera. And now I'm off to make a black corset cover to match this to do my Halloween project. Like this video if you liked this video, subscribe if you enjoyed it, or if you just want to see my Halloween costume for which I have purchased 80 yards of glitter tulle. Also, please pray for my carpet. You can also join my Discord, which is linked in the description box below. It's a wonderful place. We have work in progress Wednesdays and inspirational Mondays, and we have craft plans, and it's not just sewists, it's also all types of artists, like painters and digital artists and regular artists and all that stuff. It's a fun place, and sometimes I impulse start streams of 90s children's cartoons, and we're watching She-Ra, so make of that what you will. Join if that sounds interesting to you.